Thank you for those kind words, Jeff, and it's an honor to be here with all of you. And I know Jeff because two causes that are central to his life and have become central to mine are public housing and Israel. I have not seen as much grief and trauma and shock since 9/11. And I've often, said to constituents of mine outside the Jewish community, imagine for a moment if American homes had been invaded and American civilians and children had been murdered and maimed, and American babies had been butchered, and American women had been raped, and 260 young Americans were gunned down at a music festival, and American communities, whole communities were massacred, and thousands of rockets were fired into the United States. Can you imagine the overwhelming shock and grief and trauma that all of us would feel as Americans? And that is the overwhelming grief that is affecting not only Israel, but the Jewish community throughout the world. And so for me, it's as important as it's ever been for elected officials to show support and solidarity and empathy with Israel and the Jewish community in this moment of critical need. As far as I'm concerned, the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel is a crime against humanity that is so barbaric that it cannot be ignored. It cannot go unpunished. Hamas must be brought to justice. Israel has every right to do to Hamas what the United States did to ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the 21st century, what the US and its allies did to the Nazis in the 20th century. We have a moral obligation and a moral right to rid the world of its terror. And for me, this is about human decency. Imagine a mother whose child has been murdered in cold blood. I cannot imagine anything more callous or cruel than telling that mother, you had this coming. You and your people brought this upon yourself. And we have organizations like the DSA, the Democratic Socialist of America, that held a rally glorifying the terrorism of Hamas as resistance and calling for Israel's destruction in the immediate aftermath of Israel's deadliest terrorist attack. And for me, this is not about geopolitics. This is not about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is about human decency. It is indecent to blame the victims of terrorism rather than the terrorists themselves. It is indecent to glorify terrorism as resistance. It is indecent to lionize paragliders who gunned down 260 young Israelis. I'm reminded of a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, who said that the greatest tragedy, history will record that the greatest tragedy is not the strident clamor of the bad people, but it's the appalling silence of the good people. And what we have seen from far too many good people, university and college presidents, public officials, academics and activists, is appalling indifference, cowardice, and silence in the face of barbaric anti-Semitism. And if we as a society cannot condemn the cold-blooded murder of Israeli children and civilians with moral clarity, then we have to ask ourselves, what are we becoming as a society? What does it reveal about the depth of anti-Semitism in the American soul? And so I feel strongly that one of the lessons learned from the aftermath of October 7th is that there needs to be a serious reckoning with the deep rot of anti-Semitism in academia, in social media, in corporate America, in the political arena, in every aspect of American life. At the moment, much of Washington, D.C. is engaged in a debate about whether there should be a ceasefire, or the new buzzword is humanitarian pause. And I would make a few points. No one expected the United States to enter into a ceasefire when 2,400 Americans were murdered in Pearl Harbor. No one ever called upon the United States to enter into a ceasefire with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban when 3,000 Americans were murdered on 9/11. And if Israel were to keep Hamas in power, it runs the risk of Hamas launching an even deadlier terrorist attack in the future. Right? Hamas has openly said that it will never abide by a ceasefire, that it seeks the annihilation of Israel as a Jewish state. And so those who insist that Israel should do nothing in the face of barbaric anti-Semitism and terrorism are holding the Jewish state to a deadly double standard that no other country, including the United States, would ever impose on itself. And so enough with the disinformation, enough with the delegitimation, enough with the double standards. And I'll end on a final point that despite the tragedy and terror of this moment, I remain as hopeful as I've ever been that Israel will emerge from this tragedy better and stronger than ever before, more resilient than ever before. Israel is going to succeed on the strength of Jewish resilience. It's going to succeed on the strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship, which remains unwavering. There's no doubt in my mind that Israel will live on. So Am Israel Hai.